Tissot is a Swiss watch manufacturer founded in 1853. They have a really long history of producing good quality watches at reasonable price points. The T-Complication Squelette is a great example of a skeletonized watch. A skeleton watch is simply one that has had the dial removed and some of the movement plates redesigned in order to show off the internal workings of the watch movement. There are many skeleton watches out there, and they can be found from very low price points up to the hundreds of thousands of dollars. I think that this watch is a really great example of a skeletonized watch at an accessible price point of just under $2,000. Skeleton watches can take many different forms, but they are all really ultimately about the watchmaker showing off the internal workings of the watch to demonstrate both their skill and craftsmanship as applied to the movement and the decoration of the movement. Watch dials can also obviously be highly decorated and really extremely elaborate, especially when they're made with exotic materials such as precious metals or mother of pearl, or perhaps the most difficult material to work with, enamel. But with the dial stripped away, the internal workings of the watch really have to impress without being covered by that dial, which is essentially a fancy facade. So skeleton watches are really watchmaking in its purest and most unadulterated form. The machine itself is the decoration. It's not hidden away, and it has to impress purely on its own merits. For most people, looking at any mechanical watch movement is very enthralling, perhaps it's even magical. It's amazing to behold the hundreds of miniaturized parts beating away before your very eyes in such a way as to give the impression of life or a soul present within the machine. It's an experience that is perhaps rare in our modern and digital world. It really is incredible to think that all of these parts have been engineered together in such a way as to translate energy from a wound spring, energy that has either been collected from the movement of your wrist in the case of an automatic watch or from your hand winding, into precise movement of the watch hands to track the passage of time. And to think that all of these gears continue to revolve without the need of electricity or a battery, and that with proper service this mechanism can last a lifetime, if not multiple lifetimes. This is why mechanical watches are perhaps the most engaging and thought-provoking machines that we can come into contact with, and certainly one of the very few that we can have such a personal interaction with throughout the course of our lives. What separates skeletonized watches is the degree of complexity that makes up the mechanical symphony that plays out behind the glass, and the degree of ornamentation or finishing that has been applied to the myriad of surfaces. This Tissot has been designed to be modern yet classic. Many skeleton watches try to be highly ornate, but the Tissot is more modern and industrial in its look. The movement is an ETA 6497 that is a widely used and reliable hand-wound Swiss-made movement. You'll find it in everything from Glycines to Hamiltons to Panerais. It vibrates at the relatively slow 18,000 vibrations per hour. It has 17 joules and a power reserve of 46 hours. Unfortunately, it is not hackable in that the seconds hand does not stop running when you pull out the crown to adjust the hours and minutes. The movement takes center stage here, but the bridges and surfaces of the movement have been quite heavily modified for this setting. The main plate of the movement is wheel or cog shaped, and it's also brushed. Much of the movement has been cut away to give more unobstructed views of the gear train. Other nice decoration includes blued screws, gilt engravings, and these oblong cutouts in the barrel that holds the mainspring. This is a cool feature is it allows you to see into the mainspring so you can tell how wound the watch is. The more I wind the crown, the more you will see the spring contract as it stores the energy. So if I go ahead and wind the crown, if you look through those cutouts in that main barrel there at 5 o'clock, you'll see the spring. And as I start to wind up this movement, you will see the spring contract. You can see the leaves of the spring getting closer and closer together as the spring continues to contract and to hold the energy from the hand winding. And there you have it. You can now look in through those cutouts and see that the spring is very tightly wound. There's no space between the leaves of the spring. The face of the watch has only a thin minutes track around the outside, and it has applied blued hour indices with thick applications of superluminova running up their centres. The text on the face is minimal, with Swiss made at 6 o'clock, and then an extension of the grey minutes track out from 2 o'clock with Tissot in 1853 printed. The hands of the watch are extremely well done. They're skeletonized as to not obstruct your view of the movement behind, but they have sizable triangles of superluminova and they are blued steel, so they actually are quite legible on the silver, very metallic background of the movement. You often find that skeleton watches sacrifice some legibility in favour of displaying the movement, because it's really hard to make hands legible with such a metallic and reflective background. But that's really not an issue here. You can see how well those blued and loomed hour and minute hands really stand out on the dial. So no matter how or at what angle you look at the face of this watch, you can always quickly tell where those hands are, and you can very easily tell the time. The second subdial is at 9 o'clock, and the second's hand is also blued and skeletonized to match the hours and minutes. Considering its really diminutive size, this has been done really well, and it shows the attention to detail here. Tissot could have just placed a stick hand here, but instead they went that extra mile and made something rather special, and it's in keeping with the rest of the design. The entire face of the watch is very well thought out, and it shows a real consistency to the design. The case of the watch is mostly brushed, and it's done very well. You can see the very fine brushing along the sides of the watch and onto the lugs. The bezel of the watch is also brushed on the side and towards the face. Those lugs are very horn shaped, and I think they help minimize the size of the watch versus if they had been straight or longer. The face of the watch has that cog-shaped bridge design across the movement, and that cog design is echoed in the crown of the watch. The crown itself is quite large. It is signed on the end with a T for Tissot, and it has a very knurled or cog-like surround to it that's echoing that face of the watch. It's also really easy to wind. It makes manual winding very simple, and you can do it even if you're wearing gloves. The crystal is sapphire on both the front and back of this watch. On the front side of the watch, the crystal is slightly domed, and it has a double-sided anti-reflective coating. So when you look at the dial of this watch, it's really hard to tell that there's anything between you and the movement. Due to the openness of this movement with the sapphire on the front and at the rear, you are going to hear the ticking of this watch. Now, you're not going to hear it over other noise, but when you're sitting in a quiet room, you definitely will hear the ticking. I find this to be quite endearing, and again, this watch is all about showing off that movement, and so why not hear it as well? To give you some idea of what this is like, the ticking in my video intros is actually recorded by placing a microphone next to this watch. The watch comes on a black 22mm calfskin leather strap that has been embossed with an alligator pattern. So it is leather, but it's not actually alligator hide, it just has been made to look like it is. The strap is adequate, but I've actually replaced it with a genuine alligator strap made by deBeer of Paris. I really like their straps. You can see that this one that I've put on here is black with a matte rather than shiny or polished finish. You can also see that it's got the large scales of the alligator as opposed to the small scales that are found on the underside of the animal. So these larger scales tend to be more expensive, more prized. The strap itself is very soft, very supple, it's nicely padded, and on the inside it has a soft nubuck lining. I think that these straps are really good value considering they're genuine alligator hide and they're handmade. They're very, very reasonable. I got this one for around $85 US. Again, you can see really nice finishing on there, very soft, very supple, nice big alligator scales, and a nice lining as well on the inside. The stitching is done really well, and it's just a very, very nice strap. I kept the original deployant clasp that came with the watch. It's reasonable quality with a brushed finish to match the finishing on the watch itself, and it has a double trigger release to the deployant. If the watch comes originally with a signed buckle or deployant, I'm generally always in favour of always keeping it on that, as long as the deployant or buckle is a reasonable quality. The watch is fairly large, although it has to be to accommodate that fairly large movement. The movement was originally found in pocket watches and they tend to be quite a bit bigger. It's 43mm in diameter and it certainly has a lot of wrist presence. But I find that it strikes a really nice balance between being bold but not too showy, and I think it works really well on my 7-inch wrist. It's not overly thick at 12mm, and wearing it on a leather strap I think does a few really good things for it. It dresses it up. It also plays down the metallic feel that I think might be overpowering if you had this on a metal bracelet along with the metal case and the really metallic look of the face of the watch. Having it on leather I think also makes it feel smaller. It's lighter, it's a thinner strap than it would be if it was metal. And it also, most importantly, lets you focus on the exposed movement. You're not thinking about the shiny reflection coming off of a fancy bracelet. You're really just being allowed to focus in on that movement and on the watch itself. One other thing to mention is that this watch also has some horological accolades. As a variant of this watch won in the classic category of the International Chronometry Competition in 2013. The competition is run every 2 years and it puts watches through accuracy stress tests involving shocks and magnetic fields. So it's nice to know that this watch is accurate and also fairly robust. Now let's pair this watch with a Scotch. I'm pairing the Tissot T-Complication Squelette with Laphroaig 10-year-old single malt Scotch. But before I tell you why, let's talk a wee bit about the whisky. Laphroaig was founded in 1815 on the island of Islay, off the west coast of Scotland, where whiskies are generally known for their smoky and peaty character. The whisky has a lovely gold colour to it. And if we let it flow up the side of the glass and then wait to see the liquid flowing back down the insides of the glass, we'll start to see that its legs are really, really thick, really slow moving. This tells you this is a really nice whisky, really nicely matured, old, very tasty. You can see how thick it is, how slow moving those legs are there. On the nose, it's very smoky, and it also smells just a little bit of seaweed. You see, the distillery is right on the coast, and the salty air permeates the barrels and really works on the maturing whisky. It tastes very much of peat, with hints of salt and a little bit of sweetness to it. The finish, what you notice after you've swallowed, is really long, and you get distinct flavours of malt, wood and smoke. You know, I often joke with first-time drinkers of Laphroaig and tell them it's a little bit like drinking out of a bog. You know, and for some it's really overpowering, and it's certainly an acquired taste. But once you drink it again and again, you begin to really appreciate and love the volume of peat and the smoke and the saltiness that you get off of it. And then you actually start to notice something underneath it all. You start to notice other elements coming to the floor, elements like citrus and butterscotch, and you get a real sweetness off of it. This is why I've paired these two together. Just like the watch, the Scotch is bold and it's really in your face, with the essence of what makes a Scotch a Scotch. The peat, the smoke, the wood, the sweetness, it's all out on display. That's why I love this watch. It's bold in its display of horology, but in a masterful way that isn't gaudy or over the top. It's simply a very cool approach to doing a skeleton watch. What do you think about the Tissot T-Complication Squelette? Let me know in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this video, do please like and subscribe.